Hi, welcome back. I'm Brooke Finley. I'm an entrepreneur and the founder of Navio. We're a tech-driven, human-powered platform that helps people access affordable immigration legal support. And today I wanted to dive into one of the very hot topics around immigration, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program is currently the subject of very heated debates nationally and being blamed for things like Canada's housing affordability crisis, youth unemployment rates, wage suppression. The controversial sound bites simply don't do justice to the complexity and the nuance of the topic and its relation to other important policy and historical factors. In this episode, I want to discuss the importance of immigration, what it means for Canada as a country, with an aging population, and the impacts immigration does have on housing affordability, on youth unemployment, and on wages. And I want to root it in fact and look at the historical trends on policy and investment that are impacting the state of Canadian society today, because it affects us all. And without going below the surface, we aren't going to have a meaningful conversation that can lead to solutions that support a strong and prosperous Canada for the future. So here's the truth. Canada's current economic stress is real. Housing is expensive, productivity is weak, and families are stretched thin. But the reasons why and how to address these problems are far more complex than simply cutting immigration. So in this episode, I want to talk about productivity, inflation, the composition of our private sector, and how that's shaping innovation and productivity. I want to look at historical underinvestment and regulatory friction that's impacted our housing availability, what the evidence actually says about youth unemployment and foreign workers, how postgraduate work permits, not the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, are more closely related to youth unemployment, why immigration remains critical as Canada's population ages, and finally, why we need a meaningful conversation about immigration that addresses the root causes and doesn't just scapegoat. Public opinion about immigration is at an all-time low in terms of favorability. And many Canadians feel that Canada has admitted too many immigrants, there are too many foreign workers, and the government doesn't have control over immigration. So I want to first address affordability. As Canadians, we're feeling the squeeze on our wallets at the grocery store, when rent is due, when mortgages are renewed. But blaming immigration for affordability issues ignores the fundamental drivers of these problems. So what's missing from the conversation about immigration and affordability are discussions around productivity and inflation. For 6 consecutive quarters, Canada's labor productivity has fallen. Output per hour worked has decreased. That's the lowest slump in decades. And low productivity means that wages don't increase fast enough to pace with rising costs. Now, inflation. Between 2021 and 2023, Canada saw its fastest inflation since the 80s. Energy prices accounted for a third of Canada's inflation. Pandemic supply chain disruptions pushed goods inflation to 7.2%. So while inflation rates have decreased, essentials like food and rent remain elevated, with food prices more than 20% above pre-pandemic levels. So it's important to zoom out and have a holistic view to understand where we are and what got us here in order to address the root causes of the pain points that Canadians are currently experiencing. To suggest that affordability issues are caused by wage suppression due to Canadian employers' addiction to cheap foreign labor simply doesn't address the root of the problem and does an injustice to the conversation. And on that note, what I've noticed in the mainstream media is a tendency to describe the low-wage foreign worker program or foreign worker program stream without context. The temporary foreign worker program has multiple streams, one of which is called low wage. Now, for context, and this context is often missing from the mainstream media articles, low wage is anything that falls below the median wage in the province of the employment location. So take, for example, British Columbia. A low wage LMIA is an LMIA for employment in an occupation or in a job with a wage below $36.60 per hour. Without the context of what low wage actually means, it leads readers to believe we're talking about wages that aren't livable. All employers hiring foreign workers, just as same as those that are hiring Canadians, have to pay minimum wage, which are wages set by law in employment standards by every province and territory. When we're talking low wage, we're not talking below the minimum wage. In fact, in many cases, we're talking about well above minimum wage. So the conversation really needs the context to be able to, again, have a meaningful conversation that involves and addresses root causes and pays respect to the complexity of this matter. Now, related to that, there have been suggestions in the media that to break the addiction to this cheap foreign labor, employers need to invest in technology advancement and pay higher wages. And I want to bring some context to that, both from national data and my own experience. 98% of businesses that have employees are small businesses. These are organizations with less than 100 employees. In fact, 67% of private sector employment is in small businesses. Further yet, in 2023, companies with 19 or fewer employees made up 86% of employer businesses. That's almost 30% of the total employed. Now, why is this important to the conversation? Because these are businesses that are often labor intensive, they run on tight margins, they have restricted access to capital or retained earnings. The general discussion that I've observed in the media is that these exact businesses with less than 100 employees that are making up 98% of the private sector the suggestion is that there's higher wages and greater investment in technology. In these labor-intensive businesses, and adopting technology is limited by resources to implement, they face capital constraints that prevent heavy investment in technology. And they're in price-sensitive sectors where consumers simply cannot bear an increase in price due to an increase in cost of operating the business. Access to grants and funding is often restricted for investments in technology that are groundbreaking and completely unproven, which for small business is quite frankly completely unrealistic. And tax credits that are accessible are mired in paperwork that at the end of the day, the cost to apply for the credit often outweighs the benefit. These are parts of the reality that aren't being discussed in the mainstream conversation that is shared by the media, that are important to understand and be part of the discussion, so that we can look not just at one wide, broad, sweeping cut immigration to solve all of Canada's woes. We can have a fruitful conversation around policy shifts that can actually move the dial in conjunction with other changes, and not just look at and isolate one factor in the problem. Next, I want to address the housing affordability. Newcomers and temporary residents in Canada have been taking the brunt of the blame for Canada's housing crisis and the housing affordability issues that many Canadians are facing today. And the reality and the history, the historical data simply does not support this. In fact, the more recent acceleration of Canada's population growth was held a magnifying glass over problems that have existed for decades. Now, a Fraser Institute report that studied population growth and housing starts and availability over the past 5 decades showed that population growth has regularly been outpacing housing completion. Newcomers in the last 2, 3, 5 years are not the root cause of Canada's housing crisis. We have been historically, for decades, in a situation that is leading to this point in time where, due to the fact that housing starts and completions simply are not keeping pace with population growth. And this is especially true leading into the 2010s, which is well before the turn in a popular opinion for immigration took place, and well before the increase in temporary residents and record permanent resident levels of the last 2-3 years ever took place. We've been facing this issue. The data backs this. We need to look at why housing completions aren't keeping pace with population growth and why they haven't been for decades. The conversation has to include discussions around land use, zoning, permitting, because cutting immigration to fix the housing problem doesn't solve zoning, permitting, and land use issues. It shrinks the future workforce and tax base while housing supply remains stagnant. Now, on the matter of youth unemployment, there are sweeping remarks that the increase in foreign workers and the employers' heavy reliance on the temporary foreign worker program are the cause for youth unemployment and higher youth unemployment rates. But again, that lacks context. The temporary foreign worker program accounts for roughly 20% of all temporary workers in Canada. What most of the articles in mainstream media fail to mention is that a work permit can be obtained under the temporary foreign worker program or the international mobility program. Most work permits that are issued are open. In fact, 77% of work permits in 2022 that were issued were open. And in 2023, nearly 250,000 post-graduation work permits were issued. The temporary foreign worker program, on the other hand, typically is responsible for about 60,000 to 70,000 work permits per year. The temporary foreign worker program cuts are being discussed in the same conversations about youth unemployment, thus attributing youth unemployment to the temporary foreign worker program, simply lack enough factual information about how the immigration program and systems work to be meaningful and contributes to discussions that will lead to solutions. Because the reality is, postgraduate work permit holders are most likely the demographic of temporary workers that may be competing with youth job seekers. There were significant changes made to the postgraduate work permit eligibility to reduce the number of permits that are available. And beyond that, we also need to look at Canada's education, our policies, and investments in education. Research suggests that Canadian graduates don't have the competencies the economy needs. So again, we need to have these deep conversations and look at all of the causes, immigration included, to be able to have meaningful discussions about solutions to build a strong and prosperous Canada. Why do I think it's important that we have meaningful conversation on this topic? The reality is Canada's fertility rate hit an all-time low in 2024. And by 2030, all of the baby boomers will have reached 65 and will be exiting the labor market. That's 5 million Canadians that will be exiting the labor market by 2030. So what does it mean? It means we'll have fewer people working, earning wages and paying taxes, and more people relying on the social systems that depend on these taxes for support. So governments can raise taxes, cut services, or grow the economy, ideally by increasing the number of working age people and boosting productivity. And immigration helps on both fronts. Even with the highest scenario of immigration levels, our population is still aging. We need newcomers and we need productivity gains, not either or. Affordability pain comes from slow productivity and fast rising costs, multiplied by decades plus of underbuilding, not a single immigration stream. So if you're one of the 98% of businesses in Canada with less than 100 employees, or if you're somebody who works for one of those companies and needs to extend their work permit, visit Navio HQ for free tools. It's our completely free resource to help you explore options and submit applications that allow your business to continue to operate, to allow you to continue working in Canada, because immigration matters. Canada doesn't have a future without immigration, and we're here to help. So if there is only one thing that I hope this episode accomplishes, I hope it sparks conversation that goes beyond clickbait and sound bites and virality to address more of the root causes in a pragmatic way that will actually help us address the problems that we're facing in Canada today.